This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. For this week's episode, we are in New York City. I am so excited to be back. I know I've mentioned this many times before, but lived here in the city for almost 10 years, from 2001 to 2010, and I don't seem to get back here enough. I lived in Long Island City, Queens. We are just south of that for today's episode, down in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And joining me for this episode is Ben Clayton of Test. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thank you for having me, man. We're such huge fans of this magazine, and it feels really cool to get to sit here and have a talk with you, man.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so exciting to come back to the city. New York City is the best city in the world, and it's not even close. And if anyone wants to argue with me about that, I am completely open to that argument, but you will lose. And I am particularly saying that for my business partners from Boston, because in that conversation, no comparison whatsoever. Anyway, New York City is an amazing place. It's such a broadly diverse place. Again, I lived in Queens for 10 years, and in terms of places that have so much influence from so many other places in the world, Queens is that kind of mixing bowl of influence. Brooklyn, same kind of thing. This beautiful, kind of coming together of all sorts of world culture, and an audience here who loves pursuing interesting things, that loves exploring new flavor, that loves to stretch out their own experience and find these things. And that's exactly what you do here, Ben, at Test. You are looking at ways to try new things in the brewing world, to pull in new ingredients. You have some culinary background yourself that comes to play in all of this. And you have an inbuilt audience here in New York City that you can tell these stories to through the things that you make, with the ingredients that you use to make them and the techniques you use. And so through the course of this episode, we're going to talk about Mexican lager, which, may not sound that cool, but you guys make the #1 Mexican lager in the world as rated by Untapped. It's you have a Mexican lager with a 4.2 average on Untapped. That concept alone is mind blowing. But there's obviously a story behind that. And it's, there's an approach to that Mexican lager that is actually interesting and maybe varies from other people's process around that. We're going to talk about that. Obviously, Hazy IPA is a big thing up here, and in terms of the breweries that get noticed, it's certainly part of what you do, and we can talk about your approach to that. And then you've of course got other experimental things that you're doing, from koji fermentation and a whole bunch of other things. We're going to kind of get into that Test approach to experimentation and brewing, but before we do, if you're looking for a brewery chiller that's worry-free and tough on GWP, then look no further. G&D Chiller's Elite 290 series chiller uses propane as a natural refrigerant with extremely low global warming potential. This natural, highly efficient refrigerant with near zero GWP will lower your facility's energy costs and impact on the environment. They're committed to a greener, more efficient future. Visit gdchillers.com to learn more. And brewers, what if your yeast could do more than just ferment? With Berkeley yeast, it can. They bioengineer ordinary strains and make them extraordinary, enhancing the flavors you want and eliminating the ones you don't. Now, in addition to competitive pricing, they're offering free overnight shipping on 5+ barrel pitches. Try it out. If you don't love it, they'll happily refund you. So why settle for ordinary when you can brew with better yeast? Visit berkeleyyeast.com to learn more and start brewing with science on your side. Also, every beer menu could use a refresh button on the fruit flavors. That's why it's time to revisit Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends, where the latest additions include fruit punch, guava, kiwi, and pomegranate. They aren't stopping there and welcome flavor suggestions from the brewing industry. More information and free samples are waiting at oldorchard.com/brewer. That's oldorchard.com/brewer. Ben, we start out the podcast with a little bit of history and background. Why don't you tell us yours?
Sure. I mean, like many brewers, we started out as home brewers. wife bought me a home brewing kit around the time that they were really in vogue, where it was like, this is the obvious gift for the man in my life kind of thing. And we made a bunch of exploding saisons, and what at the time was a loft that we were living in Bushwick. I think the first beer that we made, I
in a loft in Bushwick. That's a next level homebrewing right there.
I packaged that beer long before it hit terminal. We just really didn't know what we were doing, and we were bouncing beer off of the 15-foot ceilings in that loft because it was so overcarved. And I think, like many of us, if you have the sort of mindset of when you screw something up, it just eats at you, and you can't stop reworking it until you feel like you've gotten it right, then making beer is sort of the perfect problem, because you're just never going to feel like you've gotten it right, and you end up just kind of getting sucked into this life of trying to perfect this thing that you just can't perfect. And that's where we kind of started, with no real intention of brewing, commercially or professionally. We were just hobbyists, kind of doing it for fun. And then New York State at the time, they were really trying to create these like kind of agricultural driven incentives to bring more small manufacturers into the fold. And we were watching these kind of brands proliferate around us that were really inspiring. Simultaneously, I was running a bar program at a farm to table establishment called Blue Hill, which for those that don't know it, Blue Hill is somewhat of a luminary in the agricultural space and the farm to table space. They run a pioneer model farm up in Westchester County, and there I was getting exposed to a lot of really great concepts about going up the supply chain meaningfully, agricultural biodiversity, sustainability, the origins of flavor, which was really what kind of kept me there. Just being surrounded by all this delicious food, and in a lot of cases, like things that you might not think of conventionally as being delicious, and like finding out that a radish could be the most incredible bite that you might ever have in your life, kind of thing. And while there, two things were kind of happening. We had this kind of brilliant chef who was very gifted with education. It was like education was a big part of being there. So a lot of what we started looking at were grains, and that's happening while we're brewing at home. And it was really only a matter of time before like the homework started coming home, and we just kind of started like taking some of the ideas that we were playing around with at the bar and just trying them out in beer for fun. Simultaneously, one of the magical things about working at that place is that all the cooks that go through that establishment are very hungry. They're ambitious, and a lot of them have their own side hustles, and they'll break out and they'll do these really amazing pop-up dinners. And that's sort of like where we started to, I think, move from just being enthusiasts to maybe getting into a type of brewing that was maybe a little bit more serious, but it was still homebrew. We would make these little, one-off collaborative beers with these cooks. It might be the kind of thing where like a cook's mom brought back a bunch of hand harvested saffron from Morocco from her family farm or something, and we'd make a beer with it. But we'd make these really cool little one-off beers. And that's when we started the Test Brewery Instagram. It was just kind of like to document the goings on. And that ended up opening up a bunch of doors. It brought us into the 12% Beer Project. Was fortunate enough before the pandemic to start a brand with an old buddy of mine from college at the 12% Beer Project called Free Thought. And they gave us, they really kind of opened the door to just commercial brewing. And that's where I kind of learned how to be comfortable on a brew deck. Got to really live in my imposter syndrome. And every day was a school day kind of thing, trying to ask questions that didn't sound dumb, really feeling out of my depth, but it kind of helped me get a lot of the questions answered that I needed answered, I think, to kind of even get to a point where we could think about, making beer at a commercial level in any kind of meaningful way. And then thankfully we just happen to be surrounded with a lot of great people. The craft beer industry is and can be a really amazing place. And one of our favorite things about it is just how open so many people are, the level of knowledge sharing. And we had two guys in particular that have become really great friends of mine, Jason from Hudson Valley Brewery and Anthony from Root and Branch, who really kind of they took me under their wing, taught me a lot that I didn't know. Going into the pandemic, we were looking to start a brand that kind of dovetailed with our own ideas a little bit more. And that's when tests kind of started to become this okay, this is the logical choice. We don't really even need to look too far for a brand, for a name. We're this is who we are. This is what we've been doing. And we just started kind of bootstrapping this little by little, tenant brewing, kind of hacking into some of the, going down the roads that have been paved by, Yeba and Brian Strumke of Stillwater, getting into some of those facilities and tenant brewing. And we started popping up here at this location that we're sitting in Williamsburg during a time when it was a restaurant called Strange Ways, just selling cans over the bar under a marketing permit. And we ended up taking over this location about a year ago. And this is where we've kind of tried to fly our flag, and we're kind of slowly working on converting this into our little test kitchen. This is hopefully going to become the place where the rubber hits the road on some of our more challenging ideas, and the place, like a collaborative space. We're hoping to turn this into a place where, we can bring cooks in and make beer together like cooks. And, we've got big dreams for the place, but, like I said earlier, and, like most businesses, we're just still severely undercapitalized and, figuring it out as we go.
And also doing business in one of the most challenging cities in the world to do business in. Manufacturing something is very hard in the city of New York. Even selling things to people in a business is hard. And in fact, you're in a little bit of pause as you work out some of the legal and compliance stuff around this. But there is, I know there is a little Anvil all-in-one system back there, and that you do brew on, even at a very small scale. While you are producing commercially in arrangements with some other other brewers with larger systems, you still get back there on the small system on a regular basis and work out some of these ideas.
Yeah, I try to brew on it about once a week. It's and the Anvil, we use it more like a little hot liquor tank now. But and then we've got this little it's like a half to 1 barrel SS mash tun. That's all it's a little manual thing. I love being up on a big commercial brew deck, and making beer at scale. But the thing that's always attracted me to beer is when you can treat it like cooking, when you can play jazz with it, when it feels a little more meditative and less mechanical. And that's what I really like about getting into the kitchen here. And it's a real treat to have a commercial kitchen to kind of get to essentially, it's glorified homebrewing, at the end of the day, but it feels good to just kind of get back and touch those roots and make beer the way we always have. And then, obviously like any small scale or piloting facility or test kitchen or whatever, really just gives you the opportunity to bring life to some of your craziest ideas, see how they work, stick the mash tun, do the damn thing and see what you get out the other side,
For sure. It's a beautiful thing, the way that the state of New York and their farm brewery license just opened up the field for small producers all across the state. And I know that we'd love to, decry bureaucracies and whatnot, but sometimes when they get it right, it just creates this kind of flowering, this blossoming of small creative ideas. And this is a city where those small ideas can gain a foothold and find an audience. And in some ways, you are bringing beer and making beer relevant to some folks maybe in that culinary world and space who might otherwise not consider themselves beer drinkers. And, creating those kinds of connections is also interesting as well. So let's get into some of how you approach some of these beers. And we'll start off by talking about Mexican lager, because there's an interesting story that also connects back to Blue Hill around that. Before we do that, Indie Hops brings Oregon's natural wonder to brewers, celebrating 16 years of delivering compelling new hop varieties along with classics that thrive in Oregon's terroir. Indie is the original source for Strata Luminosa, Lorien, Meridian, and their newest variety, Audacia. Release your creativity with the magic of pure, uncut Oregon hops from Indie. Indie Hops, life is short. Let's make it flavorful. And Extra Tough has been making rugged and reliable boots for 75 years. Built for the harshest conditions, the Legacy Collection styles are oil, acid, and chemical resistant with a non-slip rated outsole. Be prepared for whatever comes your way and shop the latest Extra Tough boots on extratough.com. That's XTRATUF.com. Also, if you're launching a brewery or acquiring an existing one, it's last call for our brewery workshop and New Brewery Accelerator, September 14th through 17th in Fort Collins, Colorado. Over 4 days, we engage in panel discussions, technical brewery tours, networking, and small working group sessions that help you better understand and prepare for the challenges of brewery operation. There's a couple spots left. Visit breweryworkshop.com for more information and to secure your spot. Great stuff at that Brewery Accelerator. We've got some phenomenal guests like Neil from WeldWorks will go through his full-on business plan and all of their planning and kind of show you how they've built successful breweries and the ways that they have done it. It's incredibly valuable. Also, you get to come hang out with me. And I will say there's nothing we love more than connecting with folks that have come out of that program, especially folks like Project 9 in Seattle or Good Society also in Seattle, Stem Up in Belly, like folks that go out and then win medals out there at JBF and World Beer Cup. And we get to celebrate all of their excitement. We'll bring stories like that to you. Sorry, I digress. We should talk about test here. So let's talk about Mexican lager. As we kick this off, Ben. Mexican lager, obviously a growing category in beer as a whole right now, and you take a little bit of a different approach to making some of the same and then some of the different approach to making Mexican lager. Let's talk about your inspiration behind this and the story that started building this beer.
Sure. Mexican lager is, from what I understand, the highest selling beer category in the States at the moment. Yeah. Which is wild. But starting test and trying to think about what it would mean to run some sort of test kitchen brewery. At a certain point, you have to kind of unpack what that means, right? And it's one thing to say that you want to experiment and you want to do things differently. And then it's another thing to try to actually do it. And for us, it seemed like the most logical place to start would be at the foundation. It might be the least exciting place to start. I don't think people like jump out of bed for a new barley variety like they do for a new hop variety. But it felt like, okay, if not water, like let's really kind of start with the foundation and try to see what's happening there. And one of the things that I really started to suspect working at Blue Hill is, we live in a world where it seems like everything's been done in beer, but when you get into like the sublayer of like going up the supply chain meaningfully, there still seems to be a lot of good work that can be done. There are all kinds of really amazing, like small producer grain pathways that brewers are particularly well poised to tap. And these are things that are idiosyncratic that might have a sense of place. That's where we kind of wanted to start. We're like, let's try to look at what can be done in grain, and not necessarily worry about, well, is it exciting? Let's just start there. Rewinding about 10 years ago, and this is like, when Test was just an Instagram account. This is like during a time when we were just collaborating with cooks and stuff. I was working with a backwaiter named Jorge, who, Jorge was a real visionary, like in its truest sense of the word, iconoclast, and as a kid in his, like, I want to say mid-20s, early to mid-20s, this is the sort of visionary who starts dreaming out loud over shift beers about building out a supply chain to connect multi-generation ancestral corn farmers from Oaxaca with American chefs. And he starts taking trips, saving his money from work and taking trips down to Oaxaca and, going down those roads and meeting these producers and bringing the corn back to the United States. And as he's like just starting to form these ideas of what he wants to do, we started talking about making a Mexican lager. Wouldn't it be cool to make a Mexican lager with some of these corn varieties? This was going back a little over a decade ago. Well, Jorge, lo and behold, he starts getting some of the corn varieties into the United States, and he does the damn thing.
And we should say that this is a different world of biodiversity in terms of corn, where American corn tends to be very monocultural. Within certain regions, everyone kind of grows the same thing as it grows most efficiently there.
Yeah,
there are lots of varieties.
We see like our decorative corn during its decorative gourd season, bitches, but like, for the most,
that's the best McSweeney's story ever. For sure.
For most of us, you go to the grocery store and you buy sweet corn in America, and to throw on the grill or to boil or whatever.
We also make corn for ethanol.
And in Oaxaca, in the markets, there are hundreds of corn varieties, and they all have different sugar and starch contents. They're different sizes, they're different colors, they have different flavors, they have different applications, and those applications are, centuries old. They go back to antiquity, and the culture there is like deeply tied to the biodiversity of corn, and to some degrees, it's sacred. And
I love it. We did have an attendee, not to dwell on this, one of our brewery accelerators who came up from the Chiapas state and brought me a woodcut lino print of corn.
Oh, amazing.
And, and made by one of their artist friends. And it's framed on the wall in my family room. And so I get, but yes, the corn is so important culturally.
Yeah, and like all these corn varieties, they all have different applications. Some are flavor driven, some are texture driven. Some are milling corn, some are hominies. So Jorge literally starts getting some of these corns into the States, and he connects with some of the like bigger chefs who are working in that circle, getting the corn in their hands. They become advocates for the corn. He starts teaching young cooks how to nixtamalized grind and make their own tortillas in house. He literally like kind of got this like tabletop mill built with the volcanic stones, and writes the book on actually just writes the book on masa. It's called Masa. Got nominated for a James Beard Award for it. And, like now if you tune into a baseball game, you'll see him on a Capital One Visa commercial. It's just wild that the trajectory that he's gone on. And this entire time we're just wondering like, oh man, wouldn't it be so amazing to make Mexican lager?
So you're hanging out with him and talking about corn in those early days, and like, hey,
we unfortunately were like, aside from brewing it on a small scale, like every once in a while I'd get a package in the mail, like there's like 4 new corn varieties that Jorge wants me to, kind of evaluate for brewing or whatever. And those were always like great days where it's like little like Christmas came early this year kind of feeling, when we'd kind of do these little like horizontal tastings and slowly start to zero in on some corn varieties that we like. started doing a little bit of collaborating. This is kind of how things happen here. Like in one case, we really like the first iteration of this we made for a dinner at Stone Barns. There was a chef in residence series. And one of the chefs that they brought in, this guy from New Mexico who was kind of working around a lot of like Pueblan ingredients and stuff. And they wanted to use autofile, which is one of the native corn varieties I think North America in general, but especially in the Northeast. And so that was the first time we were like, okay, let's take this corn variety and nixtamalize it and make beer. And collaborated with Hudson Valley and Stone Barns to kind of make that, and it was delicious. So we were like, okay, let's do it again. We went and got some cooks from a restaurant called Cosme, who were kind of moving on to, they were starting their own careers. Again, like kind of going back to the pop-up format. Let's make a beer for your pop-up kind of thing. And we made a sour farmhouse beer that we called Cenote. Again, using the nixtamalized corn, but playing it off of like Hoja Santa, which is an incredible botanical from Oaxaca, and some passion fruit, and it just kept working. And so simultaneously, we're piloting these lager beers, kind of, taking that like Vienna lager approach, base malt, Vienna malt, a little bit of Munich malt kind of thing, but taking that like portion that, if you were going to make a big macro Mexican lager, that portion of the grist that might be, conventional GMO corn, to make the beer like light and cheap, we're like, what if we take the cheap corn part and use really expensive corn? And the results were just stunning. Like, it's just like one of those things where you're milling in, and all of a sudden the whole brewery just starts to smell like this like floral tortilla factory. It just smells amazing. And right at that moment that you've got something, it's very tactile. And the thing that's incredible about nixtamalized corn, especially these ancestral varieties, they all have such a personality.
Explain what nixtamalized is. You've now used that word 4 times, and I feel we should explain that for folks that are listening.
Sure. I mean, this is something that I don't think our friends over at Jester King, I know they've made a beer with nixtamalized hominy, but I don't think brewers are really playing around with this yet. It has a long history with grain. Many cultures all over the world. I mean, we're talking about, in case like, this is anywhere from millennia old to centuries old, depending on the regions that you're looking at. But nixtamalization, the word is specific to Mesoamerica, but the technique is the same. The idea is that you're taking grain and you're essentially like boiling it or steeping it for a long period of time in hot water, hot alkaline water. And originally that would have been done with vegetable ash. And, now you might use lye or something like that. But you're moving the pH of the water into an extremely alkaline place. And what happens is, as the grain steeps, and in corn in particular, this was sort of like the major step forward in terms of like biohacking the corn for its nutrients, that really kind of, some of the civilizations around Oaxaca and Mexico City, they basically built themselves on this like kind of technological marvel, where all of a sudden something that was sort of like not necessarily particularly forthright and giving from a nutrient perspective, once nixtamalized, the nutrients become highly bioavailable. I'm not a food scientist or a nutritionist, so I say these things. I don't know how much truth there is behind that, but
broad strokes here.
Yeah, from what I understand,
do your own reresearch. But in a general sense,
I'm not advocating for some sort of nixtamal weight loss program or anything like that. But if there's one thing, regardless of that, if there's one thing that is abundantly clear, is that it really just kind of opens up the flavor and aroma of whatever grain you're working with. And in the case of ancestral corn varieties, some of them they become beautifully floral. You can get these like almost like blue forest notes. They're like, and every corn variety kind of has its own personality, what it shows. Some of them are cornier, some of them are more floral, some of them are earthier. Some of them even kind of become somewhat fruity. But a lot of the classic milling corn varieties for tortillas, they get really floral. And the aroma plays beautifully with noble hops. It's just crazy what happens when those two aromas start to kind of hang out in the glass together. So I don't know if that was a longer answer than what you were looking for, but in a nutshell,
so it's an overnight cook on an alkaline.
Niximalization is you're just giving grain essentially like a 12-hour hot water bath in alkaline solution, and it just kind of, like I said, biohacks the nutrient availability and just kind of transforms the grain from a flavor and aroma standpoint.
So then, as you get back to how that has then developed, you were using this and you used it in other beer styles, like you mentioned, farmhouse, kind of beer, and then in a kind of almost Vienna lagerish, initial Mexican lager approach. And, now the Mexican lager you're using it in is even lighter, in color overall. Talk to me about that development, and
Sure.
And then again, how you think about the specific corn varieties, as you mentioned, some of these that are popular in kind of tortilla making, and how those flavors with those noble hops work well.
Yeah, I mean, so the first time we brewed this beer at scale, we actually used nixtamal from Hacienda, which is Jorge's company. And being the masochist that I am, and I think a lot of brewers are going to wince when I say this, we just used like the dry flour, and I created some serious donuts in the mash tun. I ruined a bunch of people's days on a 6-hour lauter. That all just turned out to be really worth it, because the juice that we squeezed out of the mash tun was incredible. This year, the liquid that's in your glass, we kind of, took some of those pain points. We were like, all right, well, we're never doing that again. We need to find a way to work with the fresh nixtamal. There's a guy named Zach who's got now a tortilla factory called Sobre Masa, and Zach he's been a real pioneer in New York City in this space of taking the corn varieties like the ones that Jorge is bringing into the country, and then actually niximalizing them on site and making fresh masa. And Zach's also kind of like, he's been somewhat intertwined with the local brewing community. He kind of started out at one of the breweries here called Folks Beer. And so we this time around, we're like, let's niximalize the corn the day, overnight before brew day. And then we'll literally take it directly to the mash tun and kind of mill it all in by hand. So just the difference of using the fresh masa versus the dried or nixtamal, that really, I think, made the beer a little bit more delicate, lightened it up, gave us that space to kind of drop the ABV a little bit and get it into a little bit more of that like drinkable, crispy beer, flavored beer territory versus like kind of like a big and bold, like more austere, serious lager beer kind of territory like it was last year.
Sure. Talk to me about how you use hops to complement that kind of fruitier flavor in the corn, the floral flavor in the corn.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, we're just using sots. We just try to identify lots of sots that are kind of light and pristine and pretty. But yeah, there's just sort of like that like very familiar, like pretty floral character. When you have a good Pils and it just kind of flashes that nice little like bright but floral hop character at you, and you're like, oh man, that's sort of like what we're looking for whenever we're working with noble hops, and we try to hop at a rate that is maybe a little bit higher than what's traditional, because we just want that to kind of present a little bit more like the beer to be a little bit more aromatic. And the nixtamal is so aromatic that you kind of need to bring the hops up a little bit so that they can complement each other, and it's not like one is getting stepped on by the other.
Sure. And you're here selling to an audience of craft beer drinkers, or at least adventurous drinkers that want something more than just a minimalist experience. They want, to feel something from that.
Oh, there's nothing worse than like using an ingredient, going and telling the story around it, and then hearing somebody say, "I don't taste it."
Sure. Is there anything else to that overall approach, and other malt that you're complementing the corn with?
This beer is simple. It really is it's mostly Vienna malt, and then we're like somewhere in the 5 to 10% territory with the Nyximalization. And about another 5 to 10% of light Munich, just to give the beer a little bit of character and backbone and body structure, But really just trying to like push it into a territory where it feels like a Pacifico,
Sure.
But like has these like whispers hanging around it of like, oh my God, there's so much more going on here,
Pacifico Plus.
Yeah.
And just a pretty standard lager fermentation, 3470-ish or something else?
Yeah, right now we're using a Czech Pilsner strain, but, we're still playing around with that.
Sure.
We've 3470 is, I think every brewer plays with 3470 at some point in their lives. And that's certainly in some of our beers, but right now I'm just finding that this Czech Pils strain that we're using is really seems to complement the flavor of the Nyximalization, and kind of, I think it's just like a little bit cleaner, and it lets it like really shine through.
Interesting. Well, let's shift gears and talk about Hazy IPA, because I think that if we had Test on here but didn't talk about Hazy IPA, some people out there listening might be a little disappointed about that.
Sure.
Certainly, here you are in New York, and if you look at Untapped ratings, it's you and Fiden's. Fiden's in number 1 and you're number 2, but the beers that people rate highly from you all tend to be Hazy IPAs.
Sure.
Carving out space in the Northeast here, in that kind of world, is like it's a fast forward potentially to good ratings, but also carving out space is hard. That there's a lot that's been done, and you are, even the friends of yours, the people that you've learned from, who are also making some of these beer styles. You're making beers that are all in a similar vein. As you start to think about what Test Hazy IPA was going to be and what might set it apart, how did you start formulating a creative idea behind that?
I mean, the thing that we always try to talk about around Hazy IPA is that we feel like the real unsung hero in Hazy IPA are the oats, right? That's sort of like
the oats, not the hops. The oats,
Well, unsung hero.
Okay, yes, the sung hero is the hops.
I think Hazy IPA, the magic of it is what it's done to really bring people into the fold. It's kind of like the new gateway beer. It's like what the equivalent of what Magic Hat number 9 would have been for a lot of people 20 years ago or whatever. And while obviously the fruity and those tropical fruit, citrus, like kind of juice notes, those are obviously things that are bringing people to the table. But I think the thing that keeps them coming back is the texture of the beer, just how like soft and smooth and pillowy it can be. Some brewers are gonna groan when I say this, but I think in some ways, like, we kind of collectively we've almost created what might be the perfect beer, and from a style standpoint, when you try to, if you look at what a Hazy IPA is from a little bit more of a food science standpoint, that beer is kind of hitting that balance of sweet, salty, sour, bitter, maybe not umami, but like, it's kind of hit the 4 main ones, like in this way where everything is kind of in this perfect harmony, not really out of whack, nothing too bitter, nothing too salty. Just the right amount of sweetness. Ideally, so there's some Hazy IPA producers out there that are raising the mash temp. They're taking it into sweeter territories, and then all of that is on this really soft, kind of almost like melted soft serve like texture. And the oats
foam and gelée, you know, it's right. It's light and
the oats are what create that, you know? And so that's sort of like, right now our head is kind of in grain. And so when we set out to start looking at making Hazy IPA, we knew that we wanted to look at the oats as like, okay, this is the ingredient that's important. We started, just kind of pushing up the amount of oats that we were using, starting to wonder like, well, how much is too much, right? and kind of finding that we couldn't really cross that line other than like getting to a point where you're like really destroying your efficiencies.
Right.
There wasn't really ever a point where it was like, oh, this is terrible. We generally just started finding like the beer's getting tastier, and one of the things to our detriment we don't really seem to care about here that much is driving our cost up. COGS are not great here. If you're an investor, turn this podcast off now. One of the things that we're looking at, this kind of goes back to Blue Hill, but we like looking for heirloom oat varieties. There are oat varieties out there that we've worked with that are pre-war, oats that are more akin to what our great-grandparents might have eaten. And those oats were much fattier. They're higher in protein. And from a kind of practical application standpoint, what that means in the brew house is, you're essentially brewing with like heavy whipping cream instead of skim milk kind of thing. The fat content in oats, like if you're going to take an heirloom oat variety, high fat heirloom oat variety versus a new conventional variety, and you make oat milk from the two, one of them is going to give you cream and the other one's going to give you skim milk. And that has all kinds of like flavor and texture upshots for a brewer, especially if a brewer is making Hazy IPA, because then you're really leaning into those melted vanilla soft serve notes that you're looking for. I mean, some of these oat varieties, you chew on them and they literally taste like ice cream. It's kind of wild,
Interesting. So, where do you source these? You must be working outside of some of the traditional brewing ingredient sources, for some of these.
Yeah, I mean,
but tapping into that culinary world and their sources.
In all these cases, you got to go find farmers that are willing to grow this stuff.
Yeah.
And those farms tend to be small family. I mean, small, not always small, but they tend to be family organic farms. That are run by people who really, they're preservationists. They care about variety specifics. They care about seed saving. They care about, heirloom varieties. Thankfully, we're kind of like, I think there's been enough momentum over the years around these ideas that, it seems like every state now has at least a few mom and pop malt houses that have they're connected to family farms. They're working with local ingredients. And so I think in a lot of cases, like for anybody that would be interested in working with some sort of heirloom fatty oat variety, I think it starts with talk to your local maltster, have them talk to their family farms that they're in touch with, and get it in the ground, get it growing locally.
And here in New York State, again, you go back to that, that farm brewery license, and there's a clear incentive for using ingredients. You have to, use a certain percentage of ingredients grown here in the state, and it is specifically oriented towards connecting the agriculture to the breweries. So, and growing that local agriculture alongside, the breweries that are using those products. And so that building that connection to some of these smaller farmers is exactly the intent of that, that legislative piece. But then let's talk about how you then, one of the challenges then as a brewer is you are potentially dealing with, these are all agricultural products. There's going to be variance in it year to year, even field to field, and some of these smaller producers and smaller malt houses that might be working with the farms, they're not homogenizing larger, amounts of this kind of thing in order to kind of create consistencies with a very clear COA. Talk about using it from that perspective.
I mean, I think that's where a lot of breweries, I think, will probably just tune out, right? Like, and I certainly understand that. I mean, if you hit a certain size and you're putting a certain amount of beer out into the market and it's going to go sit on a shelf somewhere, you need a high level of consistency where, I think in order to kind of work in the space that we're working in, you have to throw that out the window. You have to be willing to say, I don't care if I make the same beer tomorrow if it tastes like if it's a little bit different. Like, in fact, that's what I'm looking for. I want to see those little changes. And I think that's a very hard headspace for the average brewer to get themselves into, because culturally, as an industry, we have been kind of trained to be, empirical and quality control driven, and consistency is a key part of that. Like that's like a key goal. Where, I mean, just for us as a way to mitigate it, we put an addition on every label, so that, just in terms of upfront communication to the consumer, they understand that even if this is the same beer name, same hops, whatever it is, expect it to be a little bit different. I mean, beyond the agriculture variances, we may have pulled a few levers along the way to change the beer anyway. But you have to be willing to play jazz a little bit, really, and that's what excites me. Like, I want it to be different. I want to wake up every day feeling like we're going to brew something new. And those little tiny variances are still something new. That's what allows us to bring a beginner's mind to what we're doing every time we do it.
Talk to me about using this higher fat, higher protein oat and what that means in a practical sense in terms of, how you balance with other malts, how you then make some other adjustments. Obviously more fat in the beer has some other downstream effects that you want to kind of counteract. Talk about how you then structure recipe around these ingredients.
Yeah, I mean, like when we work with fatty heirloom oats, we do keep the percentages somewhat small.
In a general, what kind of a general space?
Like, I'll go somewhere between 5 to 10%, generally a little bit closer to 5, and then we'll kind of support it with, conventional oats and malted oats and things like that. I think more than anything, it's
So you use multiple oat formats in some of these IPAs.
Yeah, it's a little trick that I learned from my buddy Anthony at Root and Branch, who I think kind of trademarked the idea. The idea of the multi-oat IPA, which has, I think you've seen like widespread proliferations. Many imitators come into the fold, but I think Anthony was the one who really kind of like put his like left his mark in terms of like how that can really push hazy IPA into these like kind of like new delicious territories. I think he's making some of the best hoppy beer in the country.
Who then also jumped into IPA brewing, and that supports my theory that Seaison brewers are some of the best hazy IPA brewers.
Just right? closet IPA brewers.
Yeah. There's a lot there. That's my pet theory.
Yeah. But he really does. I think he makes some of the best hoppy beer in the country. His beer Infiltrator might be the best hoppy beer, and for me anyway. Yeah.
Well, one of these days we'll get him on the podcast. In terms of other grain, as you build a recipe around this, in addition to the malts, the oats and all of these formats, is it obviously you're looking for light color? So is it Pale 2-row, Pilsner?
I mean, we're still very much
doing all of these things, right?
Playing around. Yeah. I don't think we're necessarily reinventing the wheel or anything like that. With the exception of occasionally working with some of the fatty oat varieties and looking for, if not fatty oat varieties, like collaborating. If we collaborate with a brewery, we might try to look at, okay, do you have a local malt house? are their oats sourced from a local farm? If yes, then you can almost certainly assume that they're going to kind of have their own little flavor and aroma and personality of their own. And I'll try to encourage the collaborating brewery to source some of those oats for the beer, that kind of thing. We're always just kind of like on the lookout for oats that are not just the conventional flaked oat variety that you're going to get from, BSG or something like that. But, beyond that, we're kind of still constantly pulling levers, playing with two-row, playing with Pilsner malt, playing with wheat, raw, malted, but like I would imagine anybody listening to this podcast has probably looked at every hazy IPA recipe on Craft Beer and Brewing's website, and I really would be surprised if there's anything in there that we're doing that isn't being done elsewhere. You know what I mean?
So then, then what makes them, rise above? Because, there's plenty of people even here in New York State and in New England and the Northeast. New York is not New England. It's, but in this general broader Northeastern area, what do you think are, in terms of building excellence into it?
I think some of it is just like getting the details right. We really manage our pH.
What do you mean by that?
We manage it throughout the brew day. Kind of make sure that we're kind of hitting our targets in the mash tun, and as we're going over and as we're going into the tank and everything. And which is again not uncommon. There are a lot of breweries that are doing that. I think the hard thing to triangulate is keeping your ear to the ground with your water profile. And that's something where it's like, there's no magic number, everybody's brewing with different water. And you really have to, like Vinny said about making good double IPA, it's like, you kind of have to just keep brewing it. And you got to keep your ear to the ground until you start to find things that work. And so, from our water profile, it just took like, kind of years of brewing, making tiny adjustments, kind of seeing where it's kind of lining up with the finishing pH, seeing how it's kind of affecting the way the finished beer feels on the palate, making sure that, you're kind of like really finishing the beer appropriately, kind of not overcarbing it, kind of getting in it in the zone where you're preserving the texture. And I think a lot of it is about just putting a lot of care into making sure that you're preserving as much of the flavor and aroma from the hops that are going in cold side as possible, so that, you really do end up with this beer that drinks like melted ice cream with, citrus or tropical fruit notes kind of like just dripping all over it, Yeah, and like, you'll have to forgive me because it's like, for me, there's like, I've done like a good amount of the reading, I've certainly read a lot of other people's recipes, but the way we kind of got to where we're at was just by playing jazz, and really just trying to like listen to our own palates and achieve the textures that we were looking for, achieve the brightness that we were looking for, those hi-hat notes, making sure that the beers don't drink in a way that feels super heavy. And I think that's the real magic trick with hazy IPAs and even like pastry stouts. It's like, getting the pH and the texture to a point where there's like this balancing act where, yes, these are big and rich and giving beers, but they're still quaffable, because ultimately a beer has to be quaffable,
I 100% agree. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of finding that balance between, water profile, bitterness, and, if we talk about it all the time, yes, these are sweet beers, but they also generally, the good ones, have a significant amount of bitterness that's back there that you don't necessarily perceive, but that also, kind of creates the support for that kind of sweetness, because, again, all of these things have to exist in this balance with each other for it to have that kind of drinkability. And
lining up the bittering staff and making sure that it's kind of razor sharp, not like, not too gripping, you want a hot side bitter in a way, or you get this nice clean, like kind of razor thin.
Yeah, herbal bitterness is fine in your Czech pills, but you don't really want that in your hazy IPA.
Yeah. And it's like one of those things where you don't want the drinker to even think about it. It's there. It's enough to kind of like prop the whole beer up, and kind of, like you want it all in line with the pH, and you want it in line with like just enough to kind of like really balance that sweetness out.
So then, where's your innovation inspiration come from in this kind of space? It's easy to feel like everything's been done,
Sure.
that there's no new space, to work in, to find creativity within in this. And yet there's also a demand from the people that are drinking your beer to try new things and to continue this ongoing exploration. And, and so what do you lean on then, in terms of that innovation and finding new ideas for these beers?
I would say one word answer would be biodiversity. That's the thing that kind of really inspires us. And what I'm about to talk about is more aspirational. Like we're kind of, as a young company, we aren't really quite where we want to be at with this. But I think a lot of the work that can be done, that we want to kind of help spearhead, but would also like to see a lot of other brewers doing. And there are brewers that are very inspiring to us in terms of like their approach, and that have kind of already made a lot of headway in this space. But I think that breweries are particularly well poised to support agricultural biodiversity. Beer kind of has this, I mean, it's ingrained in its origins, but it has this long history of working with ingredients that are not approved by the German purity laws. And I think it's really, as we start to try to chart a course forward as an industry, I think it's kind of important that we consider this idea that we can support agricultural biodiversity. And to me, what that kind of looks like for us, part of the reason why we're trying to build this little test kitchen brewery, is it means brewing the way a good cook would, and that involves going to the farmer's market every week as a starting point, not necessarily setting out to go, I want to make a style accurate dark Czech lager. It's what is available right now, and how can I start by buying ingredients from small local farms and getting them into the brew house, and then kind of going, what is the right style of beer for this ingredient? And I think if you take that approach, there's possibility becomes infinite, and it's more nuanced. Yeah, you might be brewing with ingredients that have been worked with before, and working with styles, working them into styles where it's like, yes, that's been done before. But that's where you're getting into, like, the rubber kind of hits the road on variance, right? Seasonality. And then beyond that, I think there's always so much going on. Like if you just look at what great restaurants are doing, there's endless inspiration. Great restaurants are constantly pushing things forward. And they're constantly kind of tearing up the rule book. And so there's always a lot to learn from them,
It's an interesting thing. I think when I think about, when we look at beer styles, and I think this is a particularly like a weird American approach to this, and that we've codified beer styles, that we judge two beer styles. We've created our entire list of what they are, codified, all of this. And the challenge of that is the beer styles that have grown up. They've grown up in places because those are just the beers that people make, right?
Yeah.
They make those beers. They make lager a certain way, in Munich that's a little bit different than they make it in Franconia, which is much different than they make it in, Hamburg, and it's quite a bit different than the way, they make beer in, Dusseldorf or Cologne. And these beers have grown up in these places because they're the beers of the places, and there's diversity within those things, but they're using ingredients that are accessible to them that have always been. And an entire industry grows up around those because that's the thing that grows there. And they make the beer with the things that grow because that's how efficient agriculture intersection with, food and beverage works. And I think that, our challenge then is taking these styles in the United States, making them, and not just in the United States, around the world, using some of these frameworks, but finding ways to turn them into new things, using the ingredients that we have wherever we are, whether that's South America or New Zealand or Southeast Asia or California or New York State, and finding these frameworks that we all really enjoy, and finding ways to make those things feel like us.
Yeah.
And, and I think that there's, as much as we think that innovation, we might be at the end of it, I think there's so much more space for that as we work off of these frameworks and create new things that actually evolve into their own things. Hazy IPA is a great example of that. It wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
And now it is.
It is. And it's very different today than it was when when the fire started, if you look at any of the beers that we were all chasing, at the beginning, right? Those aren't the same beers as what
Heady Topper's an American
now.
IPA now, and then only vaguely hazy. Although it is really hazy when they pour it on the hand pulled cask at the brewery there.
Yeah,
it's the best way to drink.
Worth the trip.
100%.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. And now the hops, obviously, over the last 10 years, watching New Zealand hops enter the chat, in the way that they have in such a significant way, it's been, that's been phenomenal. And of course,
New Zealand hops feel like a cheat code to me. It's just like they make you look like a better brewer than you actually are.
So what's the most what's been the most exciting hazy IPA that you've made over the last year? What was one of the things that you've made that you really felt like this was exciting to you for both those kind of creative reasons as well as the flavor reasons?
That's a very good question. I think I still feel like a kid in a candy store when it comes to hops in general. I love getting my hands on them. I love rubbing them. There are some varieties that we're just in love with from the Pacific Northwest. And like many great hazy IPA brewers, we've also become very enamored with the stuff that's coming out of New Zealand. I would say, actually, it's just, you gotta kind of ramble a little bit and then it pings your brain. But this year we actually got to host Dr. Ron, who is the inventor of Nectaron. And we've always had this keen interest in agriculture, but specifically the part of it where around seed breeding, where it's people like Dr. Ron are they're solving for the farmer, they're solving for disease and pest resistance and things like that. But then they're also engaging with the brewer and solving for flavor and aroma. And that I just find so fascinating. And getting to meet Dr. Ron and then turn around and brew with Nectaron. And we had worked with it a little bit prior to that, but we've put out a few beers since then where we've just started trying to situate Nectaron with a little bit of Citra or Ruaka or whatever, but trying to find flavor arrangements that really showcase it. And those beers have always just been very exciting for us, because it feels a little bit more meaningful to have a face that you can put on the variety and know the level of achievement. Just these varieties take a decade to bring to market if it happens fast, and Yeah, I mean, that's sort
Dr. Ron is great. He's been on the podcast twice so far. No, he's a treasure. And, the BRACT program that NZ Hops has going to test those new varieties is producing some results. And I think, the industry will start to see more of those. And you're right, Nectaron, I continue to hear brewers talk about, even while it may not be the star hop, it is also making a lot of the other hops even more expressive in some of the blends that they work it into.
Earlier in the before the summer, I think this conversation goes back to like April or May, but we were very fortunate to get kind of looped into a series of what kind of felt like a mega collaboration for a beer festival in Japan with Fight-Ins, our buddies at Root and Branch, Troon, North Park, and Brewhouse. And it just kind of felt like, holy shit. Like, I still have a lot of imposter syndrome, and I still feel like we're in this mode where we're meeting our heroes, and it feels crazy every day. Like I can't seem to get used to it. And here we're making these, like, everybody's going to make a version of this beer together kind of thing. And, during that meeting, as everybody's kind of like going, okay, well, what's the hop arrangement going to be? Nectaron was the hop that, like, everybody was just like, the Nectaron that I just got is fire. We need to use it. Everybody's like, yes, me too. I'm in, kind of thing. So yeah, that would be the one. And to get to see the way those guys, the way their minds work, what excites them. And a lot of them have maintained their beginner's mind when it comes to hops, and, to build a hop arrangement with them where it's like, somebody's chiming in with like, don't forget about Simcoe, or, this hop keef. And like, that was really cool to get to be a part of. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ron, for Nectaron.
As we bring this to a close, you've mentioned a couple of times through this conversation the beginner's mind, and I've got a book on my bookshelf about that exact same thing, and about this idea of taking on different challenges and becoming bad at things so that you learn how to learn. Mm-hmm. Talk to me, as we close this, talk to me about approaching all of this with a beginner's mind, what that means for you, and how you try to stay open to these experiences, open to, the world around you, and work that into, the things that you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's maybe one of my greatest virtues and one of my worst character traits is that I'm really not afraid to fuck up, and I fuck up all the time, and I do it in the brew house, and I ruin my own days, and I ruin other people's days. But it's one of those things where, you matched all of the bad days with the occasional victory. And when you get out on the other side with a beer that really feels novel and new, like it has something to say, it all becomes worth it. And I think beginner's mind for me, like it really starts with this idea that, we want to take a little bit more of a cook's approach to beer here, and we want to play jazz, and we don't want to be so formulaic. And that kind of means, keeping your ear to the ground a little bit, allowing yourself to be excited about things, not necessarily being pessimistic about beer styles just because they're popular. And it also opens you up to trying, like for us, trying new things, looking at other fermentation pathways, kind of like looking at Neurospora, looking at Koji, and going, okay, maybe this can be done. Let's go stick another mash tun kind of thing, and just see,
In the spirit of test, it's in the name, it's on brand, and that's what you do. I think that is a great place to bring this to a close. G&D Chiller's Elite 290 Series chiller uses propane as a natural refrigerant with extremely low global warming potential. Berkeley yeast bioengineers ordinary strains to make them extraordinary. Try Old Orchard's flavored craft juice concentrate blends that now include fruit punch, guava, kiwi, and pomegranate. Release your creativity with the magic of pure, uncut Oregon hops from Indy. Extra Tough has been making rugged and reliable boots for 75 years, and the Brewery Workshop will help prepare you for the challenges of brewery operation. If you've enjoyed this episode, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and we will send you every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, and you can read it just like Ben does, full of recipes. In fact, our lager issue, I think we've got 20 recipes in this issue. I mean, it's there's a lot.
Any Mexican lagers in here?
I believe we do. I believe we have the medal-winning lager from Peaceful Side in Tennessee. And, so always good brewing inspiration in the pages.
One of our heroes here, Vinny.
Of course, West Coast Pills. Great insight on that. We also drank one of yours over the course of this podcast. Anyway, Ben, if you want to learn more about Test, try the beers that you all make. Come experience it in person eventually in a few weeks as the things get going here again. Where do they find you?
We are at 302 Metropolitan Avenue in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. And you can follow us at The Test Brewery on Instagram. Those are really the only two places. We keep our communications pretty tight.
Fantastic. Well, it's been fun talking with you about this culinary intersection with beer, brewing like jazz, approaching with a beginner's mind.
I don't sound like an asshole.
It's, and building tighter connections between agriculture, interesting biodiversity, and whatnot. Lots here for all of us to chew on. It's been great. Cheers, Ben.
Thank you for having me, man. This has been incredible.
Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.